I'm a conservative in America, and I'm watching CNN just for the straight middle of the road. That's what I hear for 15 minutes, is it's great, and then Lonely Scott. It does look, I mean, and when you see the path, it does look like tokenism. It's kind of like the same as The View. It's like it's almost better to have nobody there, like MSNBC, than to have this.
Bill Maher just did it again, and this time it was brutal. Kaitlan Collins, CNN's so-called voice of reason, walked right into the lion's den, and let's just say, it didn't go well for her. Maher didn't just challenge her. He exposed every inch of her network's hypocrisy, piece by piece, until there was nothing left but an embarrassing wreck of contradictions. It was a takedown so thorough, so unforgiving, that Collins barely had a leg to stand on. And honestly, it was long overdue. If anyone thought Maher was done exposing the media's double standards, think again.
One, on the freeze in federal funding, who advised the president on the legality of telling government agencies that they don't have to spend money that was already appropriated by Congress?
Well, as the OMB memo states, this is certainly within the confines of the law. So White House counsel's office believes that this is within the president's power to do it.
Because this wasn't just another debate. This was a masterclass in dismantling the illusions that networks like CNN hide behind. It all started with a simple question, one that should have been easy to answer. But in typical CNN fashion, Collins danced around it, trying to sell the idea that her network was the last bastion of neutrality in an era of divisive politics. It would have been laughable if it weren't so blatantly false. Maher, of course, saw right through it. He didn't just poke holes in her argument, he obliterated it.
Okay, so they disagree with lawmakers who say that they don't have the power to freeze this funding.
Again, I would point you to the language in the memo that clearly states this is within the law.
And all that happened on
CNN, a neutral space, where both sides could engage in fair discourse. That's the lie they've been pushing for years. But the reality? The moment you scratch the surface, the bias is impossible to ignore. The guest lists, the questions, the framing. It's all carefully orchestrated to push an agenda. Sure, they'll occasionally bring on a conservative voice, but it's not about balance. It's about optics. It's about pretending to be fair while ensuring that one side of the political spectrum is always at a disadvantage. And Maher? He called it out without hesitation. He threw Collins' own words back at her, exposing how CNN handpicks a handful of conservative guests just to maintain the illusion of balance. But when it comes down to the actual narratives they push, the bias is overwhelming. Collins, of course, tried to defend herself.
You're confident that if they bring lawsuits against you, the prosecutors who were fired, that they will succeed?
We will win in court,
And
yes.
did he personally direct this, given they worked on the classified documents investigation and the election interference investigation?
This was a memo that went out by the Presidential Personnel Office, and the president is the leader of this White House, so yes.
She trotted out the same tired talking points, mentioning names, listing Republican guests, as if that somehow proved neutrality. But Maher wasn't buying it, and neither was anyone watching. Because here's the truth. Conservative voices on CNN aren't treated as equals. They're framed as outliers, as problematic figures that need to be fact-checked, challenged, or outright dismissed. It's not about giving both sides a fair hearing. It's about controlling the conversation. And if you thought Maher was done after that, you'd be mistaken. He turned up the heat even more, pointing out how CNN doesn't just present biased news, it actively shapes it. The network doesn't simply report on events. It filters them. It decides which stories deserve airtime and which get buried. And when they do cover both sides, one is always cast in a more favorable light. It's manipulation disguised as journalism, and Maher had no patience for it.
And I'm a big rooter for CNN, but that tells you a lot, doesn't it? I mean, how do you guys think you are doing in that arena of like, this is a terribly divided country. We're not only politicized, a lot of people just hate the other side. And CNN, in my view, should be the place where both sides can watch. How do you think you're doing?
But Collins wasn't the only one facing the heat. Because in the middle of all this, Karoline Leavitt, the new White House press secretary, found herself in the crosshairs of CNN's usual tactics. They came at her with the same predictable strategies: loaded questions, bad faith assumptions, and an air of superiority that barely concealed their contempt. But unlike so many before her, Leavitt didn't play their game. She didn't fall for the traps. Instead, she dismantled their narratives with a cool, calculated precision that left CNN's so-called journalists scrambling. One moment stood out above the rest. Collins pressed her on Trump's decision to fire DOJ prosecutors, treating it as some kind of unprecedented scandal. But Leavitt didn't hesitate. She hit back with the cold, hard facts. It was legal. It is legal. It's called executive authority, and every president has the right to exercise it. Case closed. But Collins, desperate to push her narrative, refused to let it go. She kept hammering the point, trying to make it seem as if something sinister had taken place. And Leavitt? She didn't just refute the claims, she exposed the entire charade.
And I'm a big rooter for CNN, but that tells you a lot, doesn't it? I mean, how do you guys think you are doing in that arena of like, this is a terribly divided country. We're not only politicized, a lot of people just hate the other side. And CNN, in my view, should be the place where both sides can watch. How do you think you're doing with it?
CNN is the place where both sides can watch. And I think, my show is evidence of that. We have lawmakers on from both parties. We'll have Elizabeth Warren on one night. We'll have Ted Cruz on another night. I think lawmakers from both parties should take questions, and you should push both of them.
She made it painfully clear that CNN wasn't interested in the truth. They weren't interested in fairness. They were fishing for a soundbite, hoping to catch her in a misstep. But Leavitt was 10 steps ahead. Every time they tried to trip her up, she came back stronger, refusing to be cornered. And the best part? She exposed them in real time. She pointed out exactly what they were doing as they were doing it. It was a level of control and composure that left them speechless. But if CNN thought they could double down and overpower her, they were in for a rude awakening. Because Leavitt wasn't just playing defense, she went on the attack. When pressed about fraud within the Social Security system, she flipped the entire conversation on its head. She turned the questions back on them, demanding to know why the media wasn't more focused on exposing government waste. And suddenly, the same reporters who had been so aggressive just moments before fell silent. Because the truth is, they weren't interested in real accountability.
According to an IG report from the Social Security Administration, there was $71 billion worth of fraud in one single fiscal year that we know about. And so that is a lot of fraud, Peter.
To be clear, that $71 billion was from 2015 to 2022, so it wasn't in just one year. And it was
$71 billion.
But it wasn't in one year, just over multiple years, from 2015 to 2022.
So are you defending $71 billion in fraud, Peter? That's a lot of money. Why is the media so against cutting waste, fraud, and abuse from the government? I don't get it.
I just want to ask a question.
We won't be deterred. We will not be deterred from people like you and the press.
They weren't interested in exposing fraud. They were only interested in protecting their narrative. And just when you thought this couldn't get any more satisfying, Maher stepped back in to deliver another devastating blow. Because, at this point, it was clear. CNN wasn't just biased. It was actively working against conservative voices. Maher, never one to hold back, called it what it was: deception. And then came the moment that sealed it all. When Collins, in a desperate attempt to salvage her credibility, tried to lean on her personal background. She pointed out that she was from Alabama, that she came from a conservative family, as if that somehow excused the blatant partisanship on display. But Maher wasn't having any of it. He cut right through the nonsense, making it clear that personal background means nothing when the network's track record speaks for itself. You can be from anywhere, you can have any kind of upbringing, but if your work is consistently slanted, that's all that matters. The facts don't lie, And CNN's record is undeniable. The network thrives on pushing an agenda, and no amount of personal anecdotes can change that reality. At this point, the cracks were showing. CNN's carefully crafted illusion of neutrality.
I'm from Alabama. I'm from a very red state. I have a very conservative family, a lot of them who are Trump voters. They watch my show every night, and I think they know that they can trust me, that, you know, we call bullshit on every side, not just whatever leaning our audience may be. And I think that's something that people actually want more.
Was falling apart, and there was no way to put it back together. But the media wasn't about to give up that easily. Instead, they turned their attention back to Leavitt, hoping to regain control. But she had already won. Every question, every attempt to undermine her had only backfired, exposing the press for what they truly were. And then came the knockout punch. As Maher wrapped up, he made one final point, one that sent shockwaves through the discussion. He pointed out that CNN's bias isn't just a problem for conservatives, it's a problem for everyone. Because when a network manipulates the truth, when it prioritizes narratives over facts, it destroys trust. And once that trust is gone, there's no getting it back. It was a moment of brutal honesty, one that left no room for spin. And for Collins, for CNN, and for everyone who had been complicit in pushing these falsehoods, there was no escape. The truth had been laid bare for everyone to see, and no amount of damage control could change that.
I also want to thank you tonight, Sean, for fact-checking James Carville for the lies that he pushed on your program last week. Unfortunately, James represents the deranged and out-of-touch Democrat Party who continue to deny the reality that this country loves Donald Trump. And in fact, President Trump is enjoying his highest approval rating from the American people than he ever has, despite the years of lies, smears, and witch hunts by the Democrat Party. The Harvard-Harris poll today is incredible. When you look issue by issue, the vast majority of the American people support what President Trump is doing.
But this was just the beginning. Because what happened next? That's where things got truly explosive. Collins was left reeling. Every defense she had tried, every excuse she had made, had crumbled under the weight of Maher's brutal honesty. The illusion of CNN as a neutral news outlet had been shattered, but the network wasn't ready to wave the white flag just yet. Instead, they doubled down, exactly as expected. Because if there's one thing the media can't stand, it's losing control of the narrative. That's why the attacks on Leavitt didn't stop. In fact, they intensified. CNN and other media outlets launched a full-scale offensive, desperately trying to discredit her. They accused her of dodging questions, of deflecting, of refusing to engage in serious journalism. But anyone who had been paying attention knew the truth. Leavitt had done nothing but deliver facts. And the media? They weren't interested in facts. They wanted submission. They wanted another conservative figure to fumble, to backtrack, to crumble under the pressure.
Big news, tonight will be Joy Reid's final show on MSNBC. Single tear, white woman tears happening right here, Joy. She was officially fired over the weekend because she's a racist, horrible news anchor with no ratings. And that's really been the truth for a long time. MSNBC's under new management, and I guess they decided to come to grips with reality. The truth is, this is very sad news for us, as she's provided so much material over the years. I feel the way I felt when Brian Stelter got fired, but he came back, and you never know. I'm sure Joy Reid will wind up doing something where we will continue to get to respond to her absolutely insane POV.
But Leavitt wasn't playing their game. And that's when something incredible happened. The more they attacked her, the more obvious their bias became. They weren't reporting, they were retaliating. They were lashing out because someone had dared to expose their tactics. And that's why, despite their best efforts, Leavitt's credibility only grew. She had faced the media machine and walked away unscathed, while CNN's reputation had taken yet another devastating blow. Meanwhile, the fallout from Maher's takedown of Collins continued to spread. The cracks in CNN's carefully manufactured image were becoming impossible to ignore, and the network was feeling the pressure. It wasn't just Maher who had called them out. Their viewership had been declining for years, and the audience they had spent decades cultivating was beginning to see through the act. The facade of neutrality was no longer working. Even within CNN, the tension was palpable. Whispers of frustration, of internal disagreements, were starting to leak out. Some journalists were beginning to question whether the network had pushed its agenda too far. Others, those fully entrenched in the ideology, were digging in their heels, unwilling to admit any fault. And at the center of it all was Collins, caught between the network's sinking credibility and her own damaged reputation. And then, just when it seemed like things couldn't get worse for CNN, they suffered another massive blow. Jim Acosta, the self-righteous face of their Trump-era resistance, announced his resignation. After years of grandstanding, of turning press briefings into personal crusades, of treating his job as a platform for partisan performance art, he was finally stepping down. And, make no mistake, this wasn't a victory for him. This was an admission of failure. Acosta hadn't left because he wanted to. He had left because CNN was no longer willing to give him the spotlight. The irony was almost poetic. For years, Acosta had built his career on his relentless attacks against Trump, portraying himself as the last line of defense against what he saw as a dangerous administration. But once Trump was out of office, his relevance faded. Without an enemy to fight, without a boogeyman to rally against, his act wore thin. Viewers tuned out. Executives noticed. And just like that, the man who had once thrived on controversy was quietly pushed out the door. And yet, Acosta wasn't the only one to fall. The woke media landscape was shifting, and more figures were finding themselves on the chopping block. Joy Reid, the MSNBC firebrand known for her divisive rhetoric and factually dubious takes, was next. She too had been untouchable for years, given free rein to spew whatever narrative best served her agenda. But now, the network was cutting its losses, because even MSNBC, the unapologetically left-wing network, was realizing that the tide was turning. The media's golden age of unchecked narratives was coming to an end. The audience was waking up. People weren't blindly accepting the stories they were being fed anymore. They were questioning. They were fact-checking. They were demanding real journalism instead of politically motivated spin. And the networks? They had no idea how to handle it. And yet, in the face of all this upheaval, CNN still refused to change course. Collins, despite the public humiliation she had endured, continued pushing the same tired narratives. She was still trying to convince America that CNN was the fair and balanced alternative, that they were the only trustworthy source of news. But no one was buying it, because at this point, the evidence against them was overwhelming. That's why Maher's takedown was so powerful. It wasn't just about one interview. It wasn't just about Collins. It was about something much bigger. It was about exposing the media's long-standing deception. It was about showing the world that these networks don't report the news. They manufacture it. They manipulate it. They twist it to fit their preferred version of reality. And that's why this moment felt so significant. For years, the media had operated with impunity, confident that they could control public perception. But now, the cracks in their armor were beginning to show, and Maher, someone they never expected to turn against them, had just driven a dagger right into the heart of their credibility. But here's where things get truly interesting. Because if the media thought this was the end of their troubles, they were dead wrong. This wasn't just a bad news cycle for them. This was a turning point, a shift in the culture. People were done being manipulated. They were done with being told what to think. and they were starting to push back in ways the media had never anticipated. Alternative news sources were exploding in popularity. Independent journalists were gaining massive followings. The old media gatekeepers were losing their grip, and they knew it. And that's what made this moment so dangerous for them. Because once people see through the lie, once they understand how deep the manipulation goes, there's no going back. That's why CNN is panicking. That's why MSNBC is scrambling. That's why even some of the most loyal defenders of the establishment media are starting to rethink their positions. Because this isn't just about one debate. This isn't just about one network. This is about an entire industry facing an existential crisis. And the question now is, how far will they go to maintain control? Will they double down even harder, censoring dissenting voices, silencing critics, pushing even more blatant propaganda? Or will they finally be forced to admit the truth? The battle for the future of journalism isn't over. In fact, it's only just begun. And the media, they're terrified. Because for the first time in decades, they're losing control of the narrative. And they don't know how to stop it. Thanks for watching. If you want to see more stories, hit that like button and don't forget to hit that subscribe button. And let me know on which topic you would like to see stories next. And check out these other video. You might enjoy. See you in the next one. Till then, take care and goodbye.